is just going, we're getting into migration. That program is picked up starting in the spring. Fort Worth is joining some of the other cities and having teams that go around first thing every morning and actually collect any bird casualties. Some of them can be rehabbed and some of them not. Joy Hager up here has did that in the spring, and she's doing it again. They could really use some more volunteers because we really don't want people doing these circuits by themselves at 6 in the morning. So if that's of any interest to you, or if you know anybody that would like to do that, you don't have to sign up to do it every day, or just go once with Joy and see what you think. Contact her, please. Okay, y'all can get together. One other thing, one of the big fundraisers that River Legacy Living Science Center does every year in the Science Center there in Arlington is their fall festival. It's going to be Saturday, October the 7th. So we have an area there, if you've never been there, it's located along a creek there, wooded area, and they have a bird line area that's got open windows where people of different heights can look through. They got a lot of feeders out there, and we have some tables and stuff out there, educational materials, talk to the kids. We've got things for them to color, help the kids talk to parents about answering questions, basically. So we could use a couple of volunteers. It goes from 10 till they want us out of there before it gets dark. So we start shutting down probably at 5 o'clock. But if we could get a few more volunteers, then we could put up times, we need to be in. So contact me if you would. And I'm gonna, unless there's a question for me, I'm going to turn it over to our new program vice president, Debbie Branch, and she's going to take care of it from there.
Thanks, Chuck. All right, I think we're in for a treat tonight. We have 2 presenters tonight. We have Maddy Kaleta, who started her career in avian ecology by completing internships in wildlife biology before graduating from the State University of New York in Oswego with a bachelor's in zoology. After graduating, she held several seasonal jobs across the country in a variety of positions, primarily monitoring and breeding endangered avian species. She is now entering her 3rd year as a master's student in biology at the University of North Texas, where she is studying American kestrels in Denton County. She is primarily examining annual survivorships, movement, ecology, and land use of migrant kestrels wintering in North Texas. And Dr. Jim Bednarz, is that right?
Perfect.
Okay. He received his undergraduate degree in fisheries and wildlife biology in Mexico State University. He has master's in animal ecology at Iowa State and a PhD in biology at the University of New Mexico. Jim has conducted research on 6 continents for more than 3 decades, emphasizing avian population ecology and conservation. Jim has published over 130 scholarly works, including journal articles, monographs, book reviews, book chapters, conference proceedings, 1 book, and was the editor of the Journal of Raptor Research for 6 years. He is currently a principal lecturer at the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of North Texas. Although Jim has studied all types of birds, he has primarily worked on migratory passerines and raptors. He is especially interested in progress and process questions related to ecological interactions and the impacts of human activities on ecological systems. Topics of research have included effect of habitat fragmentation on migratory bird demography, the influence of habitat modification on wildlife populations and wetlands, habitat and spatial use studies on a variety of wildlife species, development of endangered species conservation plans, and site suitability analysis on the Mexican wolf, design of mitigation plans for habitat and wildlife populations, assessment of the effects of military training activities on raptors, impacts of a nuclear waste disposal plant, conservation on wildlife, and basic questions about raptor ecology. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Debbie. First of all, Maddie and I really appreciate this invitation. And we love you guys. You guys have been supporting Maddie's research for a couple of years. So it's a great opportunity for us to sort of share some of the results that you helped fund. And again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this organization and appreciate you for coming out this evening. So I guess we got to start the first slide here.
Yep. Hang on. I'm getting there.
We're getting it.
Ready?
Pictures will show up next week. So why study American kestrels, huh? Well, first of all, they're really cool. Second of all, 3 reasons. Second of all, they have been declining for 60 years and nobody knows why. And so that's what's one reason that spurred us on to this research. And the hypotheses as far as the causes of the decline are widespread. I was just at a Zoom meeting this afternoon. In fact, we came up with 20 hypotheses for their possible decline. We still don't know. So that's the second reason to study American kestrel. And the third reason is most of the work done on American kestrels, most of the research done on American kestrels has been done during the breeding season. So there's a huge gap, and it's easy to study kestrels during the relatively easy during the breeding season because you put up some nest boxes, they'll nest, so it's easy to relatively monitor the nesting birds. But there is very little study done on the wintering end or the migration end of the kestrel life history. So there's huge knowledge gaps. So that's the third reason to study American kestrel. So our study objectives were, and I started this work with some undergraduate students in 2016. And our first objective was just to study and understand the wintering ecology of this pretty cool falcon. Our second objective was we knew kestrels come to North Texas in pretty good numbers during the winter, but we didn't know if the same birds return to the same spot. So our first question is, are they site fidelity? Do they show site fidelity? So we had to mark birds and then follow them up the following year to see if they return. Okay, if they did that, then we could observe birds returning every year and collect enough data on marked birds to estimate survival rates. And that was one of the big knowledge gaps. No one knew how well kestrels survived over the winter, and there was very little data on how well they survive over the course of an annual period. So that was sort of our third objective. And our fourth objective, which Maddie's going to primarily focus on, is to try to understand and document the full annual migratory cycle of kestrels. When I started this study on kestrels, we knew over 100 birds, kestrels, came to Denton County. And then come late February, early March, they all disappeared. And I've always wondered, where do you guys go? And that's the question that Maddie has been trying to answer with some of her research. So, study area. Study area is all of Denton County. We have divided Denton County into 6 sort of actually 7 sub areas. And Maddy sort of coordinates some undergraduate technicians that try to sample each of these areas. The dots show areas, all the kestrels we've trapped. We've trapped over 400 kestrels in the last 6 years or so. So, how do you trap a kestrel? Well, a standard technique is these bell tree traps. These are actually of our own design. Basically, It's a cage for a couple mice, and we build them in this, what we call, racetrack configuration, and then we tie nooses out a monofilament line. And we go out in the winter, we find a kestrel, we find a safe place, and we throw out the trap and back off. And wait. And the kestrels seem to have a good laugh. Most of the time. Under the right circumstances, if they're hungry enough, they'll come down and get snagged. So here's a video if it works. Jim, you might have to push something here. There you go. Okay, and this one we use the GoPro, and the technician Katie Sadar, who's also a graduate student of mine, is dropping the trap, and she's putting the GoPro camera so we can capture what's going to happen. The vehicle's going to pull away. We usually do this a lot faster because we don't always set up a camera. And Maddy messed around with the video, so I don't know when the hawk's going to come in. You can see this design of traps, the mice just run around because we love that. So they keep the lure animals moving. Here comes the kestrel. Okay, I jumped on it, and it's going to get noosed here in a second. Okay, at this point in time, this one's noosed really good. So if I'm driving, it's pedal to the metal, and I get there in 10 seconds. Okay, I wasn't driving this time, so it took them about 30 seconds to get to the kestrel this time. They can pull out of it. It gives you an idea of some of the excitement. There comes our technician, Katie Sinar, and then we contain the bird and process it. So that gives you an idea of what it's like to trap kestrels in the field. And the lady in the middle there is Kelsey Vile. She was the previous graduate student on the project. Once we have them contained in the can, we proceed with our processing. I think this video is about to end. Thank you, Kelsey. Oops. Okay, so here's just some photographs of the whole process that we got this last winter. If we gotta have a kestrel that's hungry enough and motivated enough, it'll come charging in. All sorts of different scenarios can happen. Sometimes they just watch the trap and leave after 45 minutes. Sometimes they'll fly over it. Sometimes they'll come in like a bat out of hell and get caught immediately. Sometimes they'll play with us and they'll fly over for a half hour and then sort of touch the trap and fly off. And then we have to sort of decide, do we stay or is our gig up? We get the birds, we put them in a can. Okay, I had to drink a lot of Welch's grape juice before I started this project. Believe it or not, we still are using these cans. I made these cans in 2016. Then we deprocess them. Importantly, we put one of these color-coded color bands on their leg, which is a permanent marker, and it has a unique code. We do a variety of measurements. And we also use a dye, a non-toxic dye, to mark somewhere on their ventral side with different colors. Now the bands are sort of a permanent marker, but they're hard to read the code. You gotta have the kestrel cooperate. You have to be close enough. You have to get a scope or a camera on it at the right angle to get the code. But we use the dye because it's a lot easier to see if that's our bird. And that works just within a winter season because of course these birds molt annually and the dye will be gone by the year it returns. Then we have to get the code on the band. Okay, so here is the processing. We measure the bill, we put the dye on. We put the anodized band, whoops, so that didn't work. Pointer here somewhere.
There's a pointer on, you can push the button.
I think I pushed the wrong button. And you use the code, this is BD, so this is the only purple BD out there. So if this bird returns then we can track its life as long as it returns to North Texas. Once we finish all our processing, and Maddy's going to talk about applying the trackers, the birds are ready for release. And then what we do is, my students, mainly my students, observe the birds, they check them at least once a month, they do behavioral observations on the birds through the course of the winter. And it's a little bit more work than just watching birds. We use spot observation. So every 30 seconds, we record whether they're perched or flying, exactly what they're doing. If they're doing a foraging attempt, if that foraging attempt is successful, try to identify the prey if at all possible. So when they're out doing behavioral observations, they're constantly eyes on birds, noting their behavior every 30 seconds. One thing we learned when we started this project, the birds use a fairly small home range. This is a bird I banded in January 20th. It was close to my house in Plano. And every weekend I got a location, and here's about 10 locations, and it used a very small area. So they set up a territory, most of the birds, and are faithful to that territory the entire winter. So the first question are, do these birds return? And the answer is yes, a lot of them do. And they return to the same area where we banded them. So the first year, we started out slow. We caught 19 American kestrels in the winter of 2016 and 2017. Next winter, we went around Denton County and surveyed, and were able to document 11 of those birds had returned. And in every case, they were within 400 meters of where we banded them. So they returned to the same place. They do have site fidelity. So that's about a 58% return rate, which is the highest that has ever been documented for American kestrel. Now that they return every year, we can actually do survival modeling. And we use this program, Mark Modeling. It's algorithm to estimate imperfect detection. That is, estimates how many birds are out there that you did not see. So based on these data, okay, we got some really interesting results. We found, number one, at least for the first 4 years of research, that the juveniles had equivalent survival as adult kestrels. So that was one of our big findings, that both these birds on average return or survive about 80% of the time from year to year. And that was the highest survival rate reported for American kestrels. We did find that the kestrels using urban environments, at least during this period, had a lower survival rate than those using the more rural environments. So the urban birds survive at about 69% annual rate, and the rural birds was over 81% survived to the next year. And we did compare males and females, and overall males survived better than females, although that did vary by year. Some years females survive better than males. So it suggests that different things might be operating on the two different genders in different years, different environmental effects. So here are some results on the annual survival. And I'll just summarize here. Our best year was that first year, 2016, 2017 to the next year, and we had a survival rate of 99%, estimated annual survival of 99%, which is phenomenal. Now, that was based on a very small sample size of birds, so that's probably not representative of the population. You can see the survival rate varied each year, but overall it was pretty high, varied between 69 and about 84%. And if we took the weighted average of all birds, this is Kelsey Biles' dissertation research, the survival rate was 82% from year to year, which is very high for American kestrels and for any raptor this size. We also looked at survival within a year, how much they survive from the beginning of the winter to when they migrate out, generally in late February or March. And here are the data. The survival rates from month to month were extremely high, 100% to about 96%, which is amazing, at least during these 4 years. That resulted, the high monthly survival rate resulted in a high winter over the entire winter season survival rate. We feel that our best data is the 2019-2020 winter, where we had the most consistent sampling, and that indicated that the kestrels here in Denton County, about 96% survive from when they get here in the fall until when they leave in the spring. We had a good sample size for 2021, but you might have remembered the ice storm in February 21, Ice Storm Uri, and that prevented our students from getting out to check on the birds. So we feel those data might be a little biased. That's why we feel that the 2019-2020 data are most representative. And that annual survival, now figure in the winter survival, okay, and we can compare that to the annual survival that year, which was 83.5%. That means 12%, or I should say, it means that math here in my head. It means that the majority of mortality, since we only had a 4.5% mortality during the winter, okay, and the total mortality was about 16.5% over the annual, then we can estimate the mortality that occurred outside the winter season was 12%, or 3/4 of the birds that died outside of the winter season, probably during the migration season, which tells us that the birds are having most difficulty during the migration periods. And I'm going to hand it over to Maddy.
All right, thanks everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Awesome, thanks. I'm losing my voice. I had a lot of meetings today. All right, so Jim talked a lot about the survivorship components and the site fidelity. And so as technology has continued to increase, we moved on to tracking the full annual movement cycle. So we have a male and a female kestrel over here they're sporting their new, very expensive, low-tech Pinpoint 40 GPS/VHF trackers. So these are data loggers, which means that they collect GPS locations and they store them on site on that tracker device. And that long antenna that's going in on the straight of the kestrel's back, that is the GPS antenna. So this is getting us our GPS fixes, and I'll talk about those fix rates in a little bit. VHF stands for very high frequency, and that is that shorter antenna kind of sticking out to the right. Now the VHF is really important for two different reasons. One, if a kestrel returns to Denton County and is in the general vicinity of where they once were, since they have high site fidelity, we can tune into that bird's specific radio channel and track it using telemetry. So if it's like in the woods or far out from a road or something and I can't personally find it, we can use telemetry to find that bird and download that data. And I just gave away the second thing, is that VHF allows us to remotely download the bird's data. And why is this such a big deal? Is because it is notoriously difficult to recapture kestrels, especially after you manhandle them for 30 minutes putting a tracker on them. They don't forgive or forget. All right, so starting in 2020, 2021, first winter, we deployed 20 GPS VHF Pinpoint 40 trackers. And then we did 24 the following year. And then this most recent winter, we put out 18 more. And so all these stars are trackers that we have put out in Denton County. So see if you guys can find any near you. And then these are some of our kestrels sporting their trackers in the wild.
But they shouldn't have to point it, yeah, and maybe they turn it off,
No, it's still on.
okay.
We'll find out.
Oh,
There
there
we
it
go.
goes.
All right, so those GPS fixes, when are we getting these GPS locations on this bird? So like we said, we really didn't know where they went, but we also didn't really know when they left. So when we first started out, the first years of this project, we didn't have any data to go off of. So we collected GPS locations every 5 days, once every 5 days during winter or breeding periods, during stationary periods. But we collected GPS fixes every 3 days for like a month and a half period when we thought they might be migrating. So we were casting a bit of a broader net when we first started. All right, so in 2020-21, we put out 20 trackers. So the following year, we were hoping maybe 20 trackers would return to us. We had 6 of those return, or 7 of those returned. 6 were available during these set download periods where we predetermine when we're allowed to download them. Because if you let it run all the time, that battery will drain super quickly. And of those 6, we got data on 2. And I hope watching those numbers dwindle was as heartbreaking for y'all as it was for me, but we got some really cool data from these 2 birds. So we'll go ahead and introduce them. First bird is a male American kestrel, RW. He is a very special bird. He was one of the first birds that Kelsey Biles trapped on her time on the project back in 2018. They estimated he was at minimum 2 years old, but closer to 3 or 4. They actually managed to do the impossible and recapture him back in 2021 and deploy him with the tracker. You can actually see he's much less happy about this situation the second time around. But you can see that little backpack attachment style, that little harness on the front of his chest. And then I managed to find him almost a year later and download his data. So he was at least 6 years old by the time he returned, 6 or 7. So the second bird has got to be the complete opposite, right? So we have now a second year, a juvenile female American kestrel. She was captured in January of 21. And let's see if I can, that's Jim releasing her. We're checking out, making sure she has really strong flight. And so she's fighting that North Texas wind pretty hard, but she's doing great. And we resighted her a year later and successfully downloaded her tracker. All right, so let's get into the cool maps now. All right, so RW's migration, we got 90 GPS fixes over a 344-day period. He initiated a spring migration on March 16th and kept migrating through the 25th. He traveled 1,083 kilometers from Sanger, Texas, all the way up to Norton, Nebraska. And he traveled that period over 9 days at a rate of 120 kilometers per day. He is much faster than I am. So he then went on his fall migration, very end of September through mid-October, and he traveled almost the same exact distance over a 12-day period. But I do want you to recognize that his spring migration is actually more easterly of his fall migration, which is on the western side, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But you'll also notice he took his time getting back down to Texas, so he went at a rate of 90 kilometers per day. So we did do some home range analysis, a little bit more advanced than the visual home range analysis using the GPS trackers. So we obtained 33 locations over 134 days, both in the beginning of the year and the end of the year when he returned. And we conducted 2 main types of home range analysis. So we did MCP, which stands for minimum convex polygon. The larger ones are represented by the solid line and the 50% are represented by the dotted line. And then we did kernel density estimators, and these require a bit more points, so not all of them have the full 95%, but these are just 2 different methods, and we decided to implement both. So comparing the 95% minimum convex polygons, he had a home range area of 92.8 hectares, which is represented by that dark gray outline. And then for his summer home range, he had a home range of 83.68 hectares for that 95% MCP. And the reason we did those 50% minimum convex polygons and kernels is to look at the core home range that is used. So the core area that they're using versus their whole actual home range of territory. And so for that summer home range, we got 52 locations over 189 days. So we had a lot more data to go off of there. It's gonna pause on you again.
That must be me when I'm moving that talking thing. to
Oh,
do
yeah.
it. Try it. Try it now.
There we go. All right, female DN. So that was our first year female that we got data on. You'll notice her migration looks a little bit different. We only got 98 GPS locations over a 98-day period. She did her spring migration from the 19th of March to the 3rd of April, and she traveled a shorter distance at 878 kilometers, over 8 active days, but for a rate of 97 kilometers per day. So she's a little bit slower than her male counterpart, but she did take over 15 days in total. However, you'll notice that her GPS malfunctioned after April 24th, and we no longer got any data, but luckily the VHF still works, so we were able to re-download her when she returned. So looking at her winter home range, we only had 16 points over 62 days because of that first portion of the year. And so she had a bit of a smaller home range area, so she took up an area of 35.48 hectares. But she did show us a really unique stopover site. So this area from Salina, Texas, all the way up to Natoma, Kansas is where she stopped over. And she stopped there for a 6-day period, of which we got about 3 locations. And then she finally made her way all the way up to Oberlin, Kansas, where she hopefully bred successfully. We got 8 locations over a 20-day period, and she had about the same home range size, about 37 for the summer and winter. All right, so now we know some data. We got a little bit of data to go off of. We have some inkling of where these birds are going and when. So we went ahead and made a much more complicated GPS fixed schedule, of course. So in summary, during wintering periods, we got locations every 8 days, every 15 days in the summer. And then for a 2-week period, when we really thought they were going to be migrating, we got GPS points every single day. We really wanted to know when they were stopping, where they were going, and how fast they were moving. But we also want to make sure we didn't miss it. So we did a 2-week buffer period before when we thought they'd migrate and after, and got GPS points every other day, just to really cover our bases. All right, so we put up 24 tracker birds in 2021 to 2022. That was my first year on the project. And so out of that 24 tracker birds, we had 6 of those return. Of those 6, we encountered 2. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So out of those 2 birds, we had E23. E23 was a very feisty first-year female. She was found back in her wintering area, so she did migrate and come back. Unfortunately electrocuted by COSERV, who now is actually working with us to put up nest boxes and help the kestrels. So they've been actually a really great asset. And unfortunately, in her untimely death, she did have a prey item in her talons. So she was being a very successful hunter and hopefully was leading a good life prior to that. Unfortunately, as you can see, the tracker was too far damaged for us to actually retrieve any data from it. And so speaking of unfortunate trackers, the other female was EW. This bird is burned into my mind. It took 3 people to get her tracker on her. She was also a very feisty first-year female. She did migrate and return back to Denton County, and I did successfully download her just to find out that we only had 1 GPS location on January 1st in her wintering territory. So we unfortunately got no data from Ms. EW either. And then lastly, this is a very special story to me. This is bird E78. He was actually on the cover of Audubon magazine back in March, I believe. We captured him with the Audubon team back on December 11th of last year, where he got his famous photo shoot. And while we did not yet see him this upcoming winter, because he's supposed to be returning for the first time this winter, we actually got an email from Scott Kimball up in Kansas, who said, "Hey, I think I have your bird." And so sure enough, we only have 2 birds with a red band with an E on it and a tracker. And we were able to get enough photos from Scott to actually identify this as B78. And so you can see him with his little tracker antenna pointing out, and he is munching on something yummy up there. And so Jim and I decided to drop everything. He was in the middle of the painted bunting season, and we dropped everything and drove all the way up to Kansas to see our bird. And we brought our mist owl and our mist nets and our mechanical owl to try to recapture him because he had a nest. And he was not using Scott's nest program. He actually made his own nest in a man-made structure, which has been the tendency of our birds. So we drive all the way out there and we tried, and he was just not really feeling it. He would swoop around and he would just say, not today, I've got chicks to feed. So we were able to see that he hatched 3 healthy chicks. They all eventually had fledged. And Scott was so kind to take all of our gear from us and actually drill holes into the cement to recapture this bird for us using those mist nets. And he was successful in capturing not only him, but his unbanded female. And so he was able to recapture him, cut his tracker off preemptively so that we could have more of a bird in hand situation. So we could get that tracking data and hope that it didn't actually fail to download in the winter. All right, so let's look at his super weird migration. All right, so he started also up in Salina and he got 46 points over a 182-day period. He initiated his spring migration on the 14th of March, and he decided he wanted to take the scenic route. He traveled 1,183 kilometers, about what the same as RW, over 10 active days. But the straight line distance was only 629 kilometers, so he really did take the long way around. And so he was then found on 19th of June this year, and his GPS was removed. All right, so looking at his wintering territory, he has a few outlier points there. But his wintering territory is about the same size as the other mills at about 70 hectares. And we got 17 points from last winter. Now for the interesting portions, we also have his stopover sites. He not only did 1 like our female, but he went above and beyond and did 3 different stopover sites. So he took a little vacation in Whippoorwill, Oklahoma for a 3-day period in March. Then he went and hung out in Humboldt, Kansas, because state lines don't matter to birds. And he hung out there for 2 days. And then he went to Bartlesville, Oklahoma, which is really funny because I actually worked 2 miles from where he went in the stopover site. He hung out there for about a 5-day period. They've got like some nice prairies. Before finally going all the way up to Willow Springs, Kansas, where he summered. And this is where he had his own breeding area. So we got only 11 locations over 71 days in total. Yeah, 71 days. And so unfortunately, he actually had a very small home range that we actually witnessed when we were making him angry. And he had only 6.17 hectares for his 95% MCP. Though the kernel density did estimate a much larger area. But he seemed to really like more urban areas compared to our other 2 birds. All right, so that is all the migration data that we currently have. So in the past, mean date for fall passage has been around September 23rd, according to Hawk Mountain. Our male initiated his fall migration on September 30th, because we only had that 1 male who did fall migration. There are differences in migration timing between age and sex classes, and we had quite a variety. We had a first-year male, a first-year female, and an after-hatch-year male. And so the average date of spring migration for all of our birds was March 16. So kestrels are being reported to migrate earlier and earlier as spring temperatures increase, especially with these short distance migrants. They're able to kind of predict the weather on their breeding ground and migrate earlier, which allows them to arrive when the resources are going to be the most ideal and most plentiful. And so some of our short distance migrants that we've reported hopefully have it a little bit better off than those long distance migrants that might come back to fewer resources by the time they get back there. Home range has previously varied in all the past literature. Again, it's mostly been conducted in the summer breeding period, so there's very little data on that winter home range analysis. And it's ranged anywhere from 2 to 95 hectares. Larger summer home ranges are expected. However, home range size, so smaller home ranges are found with higher densities of prey, as well as higher densities of other raptors or kestrels themselves. And so comparing the 3 home ranges, RW did have a smaller winter home range. DN had about the same size, and E78 actually decided to once again throw us to relief and have a much smaller summer home range. So again, with limited location points and a smaller sample size, it's kind of hard to make broad conclusions from that. Looking at the migration performance or speed and different aspects of how they migrated, On average, for all three birds, they migrated at a rate of 116 kilometers per day over 9 active days, and then they stopped over for an average of 9 sites for 2 locations. In the fall, we only had one individual, he did 90 kilometers a day, so shorter, or slower migrations in the fall than in the spring, and he took 12 active days to get back down here. Spring migration is almost always faster for avian species because they are trying to race to the breeding grounds, get the resources, the best nest spot set up so they can have more successful chicks. Other literature, they have pretty much only had long distance migrants. However, our birds were keeping up with kind of similar rates to their longest distance migrant that traveled over 6,000 kilometers. So our birds are definitely not going for the Olympics. All right, the other thing we want to look at was migration patterns. So we looked at 2 main migration patterns. The first one is leapfrog migration. This is where birds of more northern latitudes will actually migrate way further and go to more southern latitudes, where birds in kind of more the mid area will migrate shorter distances. And it looks like our birds are falling into that latter category. Males also tend to migrate shorter distances than females. And our males actually migrated slightly longer distances than our single female that we had, but again, small sample size. Hunt et al. In 2023, they just recently published some new kestrel data. It's 1 of 2 papers out on kestrel migration. They also found evidence of leapfrog migration. So I can't speak to the full concept of leapfrog migration, but our birds are aligning with that. The other thing, if you remember, I mentioned that RW had that weird loop pattern where one side was more easterly than the other. So he is the first bird, to our knowledge, in the literature that actually completed a loop migration, a first kestrel to our knowledge. And so this is due to possibly wind conditions or seasonal difference in habitat distribution. It's been found in marsh harriers, Eleanor's falcons, as well as lesser kestrels. And it has been reported that kestrel altitude will change with wind speed and direction. So we are thinking that wind conditions may be actually impacting and causing that loop migration pattern. So we're excited to look more into that. All right, now what is going on with all those tracker failures? So we had 44 trackers over 2 winters, 29.5% return rate, 13 of which returned. And we had a 27.5 failed download rate. And then depending on your definition of success, we had a 2.3 to 6.8 success rate, one of which though we did cheat and removed prematurely. Any data at this point is very exciting data. Again, there have only been a handful of birds who have had their migration reported with GPS. So we are very excited about our very small success rate. Other papers have also reported really tricky situations with these trackers. They were really good on like red-tailed hawks and these bigger species that can carry these really heavy trackers. Our trackers are like 2.5 to 30 grams. We don't want them over 3% of the bird's body mass. Most of our tracker birds that can get a tracker have to be over 100, 125 grams. So finding birds that are fat enough in February can be a little bit challenging. But they found that they actually were only able to recover 12% of geolocator trackers. They also had 82% of their transmitters, both low-tech brand that we use and microwave brand, failed prior to them even migrating. And then the only other paper, they deployed 5 tags, relocated 2, and only got data from 1. And then they deployed another 4 and found none of them again. So the trackers are definitely tricky as the new technology is still managing to advance. And moving forward, we deployed 18 trackers last year. It was a rough winter, it was pretty warm. And so we're hoping maybe all 18 will return to us this year. But we have a new graduate student who is actually here with us today. For Crater, she's going to be focusing on a few different things, but in generally speaking, they're potentially looking at wintering home range ecology and land use, as well as use of urban roost features. So that is where this project is going as I start wrapping up my own thesis. As always, this project goes way beyond Jim and I for all the people that have helped us. And a special thank you to Fort Worth Audubon, who has funded me for the last 2 years doing thousands of miles of gas, for thousands of miles of driving for all of our gas costs. So definitely appreciate it. And thank you guys so much for having us out to chat a little bit about kestrels.
Questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Lights, maybe lights, please.
Yes. Do you often get information from outside of the area that says, hey, I've spotted one of these birds? And if so, if I were to spot a bird like that, where would I even go to figure out who